This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at NumberFire.com, and this is episode 546 of the Late Round Podcast, so many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. I try not to hide from bad takes. I've got a process, and I feel good about that process. That process has led me to really good results across the years and years that I've been analyzing fake football. I want to start this sleeper show each week with a recap of last week's picks. And let's get it out of the way. Last week's sleeper show was not great. I think the process was there for some players like Boston Scott or Paris Campbell. I just got the players wrong in those offenses. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that it was week one. We just don't know exactly how teams are feeling about players. Elijah Moore was probably the most disappointing miss, though. I really thought that he had a chance to blow up last week. And he walked away with fewer receiving yards than he had entering the game. Sam Darnold was at least a good streaming option. Tyson Williams did his thing. And James White was fine in PPR formats. Not everything was terrible. And we should expect a lot of misses given I'm talking about super low-tiered players. But I expect way better than last week's results on this show. I'll be the first to admit that. And the results should get better because we'll get more and more information on these players. The feedback I received for the new show format was almost entirely positive. That was great to hear. So we're going to stick with this sleeper show as opposed to going back to the matchup show. I made some changes based on feedback this week, and I'll talk about that as I get to each section today. Before getting to this week's sleepers, though, I want to let you know that FanDuel is giving you the opportunity to get in on the NFL action each week with the NFL Sunday Million. This week, the prize pool is a whopping $3 million. First place is taking home $1 million. All you have to do is head over to FanDuel, click on the NFL Sunday Million contest, fill out your lineup, and enjoy. Eligibility restrictions apply. Go to FanDuel.com or download the FanDuel app for more details. So last week I introduced 3 buckets for these sleepers. Players rostered in 21 to 50% of Yahoo leagues, players rostered in 10 to 20%, and then players rostered in under 10%. Seeing how things are shaping up, I'm shifting these parameters just slightly to 25 to 50%, 11 to 24%, and under 10%. I just realized that otherwise we'd basically never have running backs in that middle or bottom tier. I'm just giving myself more options. I know it's not really a meaningful change, but I know someone would get upset at these recommendations based on these arbitrary parameters. Someone would find a way to get mad. So I'm making sure that I'm clearing the air from the start. Anyway, let's kick things off by talking about 5 players that I like this week who are rostered in 25 to 50% of Yahoo leagues. The first is Ben Roethlisberger. Yes, that Ben Roethlisberger. The guy who looked super dusty in week 1 against the Bills. This game sets up really well for Pittsburgh in general. They're at home, and they're facing a beatable defense in the Raiders, a team that's coming off an emotional win on Monday night. So it's a short week for them, and they're traveling east for an early start game. FanDuel Sportsbook has the Steelers as 5.5-point favorites. That gives them an implied total of over 26 points. If Pittsburgh posts 3 or 4 touchdowns, chances are Roethlisberger's going to have something to do with that. And for the record, the secondary numbers weren't atrocious in week 1 for Big Ben. He still pushed the ball downfield at an above average rate. Over 18% of his passes went 15+ air yards, and he completed half of those throws. I think he's a relatively safe option this week if you're looking for a streaming quarterback. Now, if you'd rather not stream Roethlisberger, you can go with Mac Jones. He's rostered in 25% of Yahoo leagues, so he makes the cut here, and he's in a good spot against the Jets. New York was not great in week 1. They allowed Sam Darnold to finish the day with a 47% success rate, according to NumberFire's expected points model. That's not like spectacular, but it's also Sam Darnold that we're talking about. Mac Jones actually had a 55% success rate in week 1 in a tougher matchup. This week against the Jets, New England's implied total is north of 24. I do wish that in week 1, Mac was a little bit more aggressive throwing the ball in intermediate and deep length. His 15+ air yard rate was only 10.3% last week. That was one of the lower marks in the league. But he should be fine if you really need a streamer in a deeper format. I'll get to my favorite quarterback streamer in a bit, but first, let's talk about Mac Jones' running back, James White. White really should be rostered in more leagues than he's rostered in. He's available in 62% of Yahoo leagues. He's not sexy, he's not going to give you a super high ceiling, but he's absolutely usable in PPR formats. He had an 18.4% target share in week 1. And while we shouldn't expect him to see a lot of work on the ground, you do have to at least wonder how the Patriots are going to divvy up that ground game workload this week, because both Ramondre Stevenson and Damian Harris fumbled last week. So once again, White is a flex play in PPR leagues. Sterling Shepard's in play this week as well. He was someone I mentioned on the 15 transaction episode earlier this week, even though he wasn't a transaction. I just wanted to throw him out there because he was still a good ad. I just wanted to give people players who are rostered in fewer leagues. But Shepard is under that 50% rostered mark after coming off a game where he saw a quarter of the Giants' targets. I do worry a little bit about the kind of pressure that Washington might be able to generate in this game. Week 1 wasn't great for the Washington defense, but we know that they can get to the quarterback. Fortunately, though, Sterling Shepard is a lower average depth of target wide receiver compared to his counterparts. In Week 1, his ADOT was under 10. Darius Slayton's was 12 and Kenny Galladay's was over 16. So he could get peppered once again, with Washington likely being able to get to Daniel Jones. And then the last player in this tier is one that I talked about on the 15 transaction show, and that's Jared Cook. He had over 17% of the Chargers' targets in Week 1, and he ran just 10 fewer routes than Mike Williams and 9 fewer routes than Keenan Allen. Meanwhile, he more than doubled Donald Parham's routes run number. Now they get Dallas. Not only was Dallas gashed by Rob Gronkowski last week, but this game could just shoot out in general. There's a 55.5 point over-under, and there's just a 3-point spread. The Chargers could score points. And that's exactly the kind of offense you want to tie your tight end streamer to. But like I mentioned earlier this week, I think Cook has season-long upside too, not just this week. Let's now move on to players who are rostered in 10 to 25% of leagues over on Yahoo. And let's start with my favorite quarterback streamer this week, Teddy Bridgewater. Just to reiterate a stat that I talked about on the 15 transaction show, my buddy Rich Rebar at Sharp Football Analysis mentioned on Twitter this week that Jacksonville's now allowed 24 or more points in 16 straight games. Denver has an implied team total above that, which makes sense. The Jags were just beat big time by Tyrod Taylor. He had the third highest passing yard total of his career last week. Even without Jerry Jeudy in that lineup, Teddy Bridgewater has good options to throw to. I like him a lot in this game against Jacksonville. It's hard not to. You can look to Bridgewater's pass catchers in this matchup against Jacksonville too. Tim Patrick is the safer option off the waiver wire between him and KJ Hamler, but Hamler's in play this week too. I'm just grouping him in this section because of Patrick, but Hamler's rostered in fewer than 10% of Yahoo leagues. But Patrick and Hamler had the same number of targets last week. Patrick just played 22 more snaps, and he ran 7 more routes. Hamler's a big play threat waiting to happen though, and he's going to at least play in 3 wide receiver sets. So both guys work this week off the waiver wire in a plus matchup. I briefly touched on Adam Troutman on the 15 transactions episode, and if you need a tight end streamer, I think he works. Only Darren Waller had a higher week 1 target share at tight end than Adam Troutman did. And even though Jawan Johnson was used close to the end zone last week, we have to always look at the usage peripherals. Troutman ran twice as many routes and he had twice as many targets as Johnson. In a world where the Saints pass more, which could happen since we can't assume they see the same game script week in and week out, Troutman could then see a lot of volume. That's why he's a reasonable streamer. And then lastly in this tier is Kenneth Gainwell. Again, someone I talked about earlier this week, which is bound to happen given I'm talking about waiver wire targets. But I'm low-key a little bit worried about what happens with Miles Sanders if and when the Eagles face a negative game script. We saw Gainwell run just 7 fewer routes than Sanders in week 1, and he got 2-minute work, and he tallied a 9.4% target share. Now the Eagles are 3.5-point underdogs at home. It's unlikely we see them beat San Francisco like they did Atlanta. That means that we could see more Gainwell on the field than expected. There actually is one more player in this tier, and that's Marquez Valdes-Scantling. I love MVS as a sleeper this week. He had a 22% target share in Green Bay's loss last week, and he saw a 17-yard average depth of target. The Packers just couldn't get anything done offensively. But they should be able to get it done this week against Detroit. It's got obvious bounce-back game potential for Green Bay. And they've got a 30-point implied team total. I want a piece of that offense, and I think that you can get that with Marquez Valdes-Scantling. I already gave you one player rostered in fewer than 10% of leagues who I like this week in KJ Hamler, but let's look at a few more. How about Anthony Schwartz? He doesn't have a scary matchup against the Texans, and Odell Beckham has already been ruled out for week 2. In week 1, Schwartz saw 18.5% of Cleveland's targets, despite playing the 3rd most snaps at wide receiver on that team. Now that snaps played thing is kind of an issue. Ideally, he'd be playing ahead of Donovan Peoples-Jones. Peoples-Jones played 16 more snaps. But it was also Schwartz's first game as a pro. And that utilization rate or targets per snap rate, that was the best on Cleveland in week 1. And he's a big play threat too. He's capable of paying off on just one play. So he's an interesting deep option this week. If you'd rather play it safe and go in the other direction, and I hate that I'm even saying this right now, Hunter Renfrow has a good matchup. Renfrow usually plays in the slot. He played 68% of his snaps from there in week 1 against Baltimore. Now, Pittsburgh's defense is good, but the scheme allows for a lot of looks to go to that area of the field. In fact, in week 1, only the Bears allowed a higher percentage of targets to go to the slot than Pittsburgh did. And last season, Pittsburgh ranked second in the league within that category. If the Raiders see a negative game script, they could throw more. If those throws go to the same place Pittsburgh's opponents typically attack, then Renfrow could be a high floor option in PPR formats. Now, lastly in this tier, let's talk about the Cowboys. This is an offense that we want pieces of. And that's especially true when those pieces are cheap because of an injury. Michael Gallup being out opens things up for some of the second and third tier options on that team. Cedric Wilson is likely to step up in 3 wide receiver sets, so he's in play, but so is Dalton Schultz. I'm preferring Schultz to Blake Jarwin just because he saw 2 more targets and he ran 4 more routes in week 1. If you like Blake Jarwin, go for it. All of these players are under-rostered though, given what they could do in this Dallas offense without Michael Gallup. And this week, like I said, it's a game with a very high over-under. You're going to want to have a piece of this offense, not just this week, but moving forward. One piece of feedback on last week's sleeper show that I got was to provide more high-rostered players to bench. I'll try my best, but it's not always easy to find them. I do have 6 of them for you, though, this week. Trevor Lawrence is rostered in 75% of Yahoo leagues, and I would not be starting him against Denver. I know the Broncos defense wasn't that incredible against Daniel Jones, considering Daniel Jones still posted 21.4 fantasy points in week 1, but he did a lot of that on the ground. He brings that element to his game. And Trevor Lawrence can do that too, but he did not show it off in week 1 at all. Denver entered the year with arguably the best secondary in the league, and even though Ronald Darby is out, they're still not an attractive matchup. Robbie Anderson was a sell in 15 transactions this week because of his 9% target share in this new look Panthers offense in week 1. And I think that lack of volume is enough to make you second guess starting him this week. I did say on that show that Anderson is probably going to see more work moving forward. But the question is, how much work? And how predictable is that work going to be? And then on top of that, New Orleans looked good defensively in week 1. That just piles onto this worry. So I wouldn't fault anyone for benching Robbie Anderson in week 2. If he goes off, great, you still have him. But he's not the easiest start in the world. I'm going to go back to Saquon Barkley this week too. That's someone I called out as a potential sit last week. He gets a tough Washington front this week, and he didn't look his typical self in week 1. He also finished with below average, especially for him, below average backfield numbers. Or I guess I should say below average versus expectation. He saw 71% of their running back rushes and an 8% target share. Maybe they involve him more in week 2. I would honestly hope that's the case, but the matchup is not attractive enough for me to deem him a must start. Mike Davis's usage in week 1 was actually pretty good. He had 62.5% of the Falcons' running back rushes and a really strong 18.2% target share. But he faces the Bucs this week. The Falcons' offensive line looked atrocious in week 1. And that's a big worry against the Bucs. We saw Tampa Bay do work against the Cowboys running backs last week. I think Davis is going to be pretty touchdown dependent here in week 2. Mark Ingram is now rostered in a lot of leagues after last week's performance. I understand the allure in getting him, but keep 2 things in mind. He wasn't really utilized as a receiver in week 1, and that was in a game with a positive game script, an insanely positive game script. Now he gets a tough matchup against the Browns where that same script is very unlikely. David Johnson would be the play from that backfield this week because of his receiving work. And I feel like Ingram isn't going to be an easy player to trust this year. And remember, targets are worth more than rush attempts, even in standard leagues. Ingram won't see much volume through the air more than likely this year. And then the final player that you can consider sitting this week, and I know it sounds a little crazy after he scored twice in week 1, but it's Josh Jacobs. In that week 1 game against Baltimore, Jacobs really didn't see great peripherals despite finishing as the RB14 on the week. He had just a 3.9% target share to go along with a 62.5% running back rush share. He only totaled 40 yards. He just found the end zone twice. Now he's banged up. Now he gets a tough matchup against Pittsburgh in what could end up being a negative game script. He really is not easy to trust in week 2 at the moment. Now, as I did last week, I'll end today's show with 2 defensive streamers that I don't mind this week. The first is the one that I talked about in the 15 transactions episode, and that's Green Bay. They're a home favorite, and they're not just a home favorite, they're a massive favorite. They're likely going to catch Jared Goff in a negative game script. That means the potential for both sacks and turnovers. So don't drop Green Bay after what they did last week. Don't give up. And then the other defense that I don't mind is the Giants. They're rostered in just 6% of Yahoo leagues, and they'll get Taylor Heineke and the football team this week. FanDuel Sportsbook has that game with just a 40.5 point over-under, and the Giants are 3-point road underdogs. So it's a pretty evenly matched game that's expected to be low scoring, with a backup quarterback under center. That's the type of matchup that's decent to target for a streaming defense. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter at LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. We got one more show this week, the mailbag episode. I'll talk to you then.